Hello everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to speak to you today about artificial intelligence at Autopsy. I'm Edwin Monuki. I am the Chair of Pathology and Lab Medicine and also the Director of the Neuropathology Core for our ADRC. So first, let me go over an outline of what I will talk about today. First, I will describe what is artificial intelligence for those of you who are less familiar with the subject. And importantly, I want to discuss why all the hype. Why is there so much hype about artificial intelligence? And if we do realize the potential of AI, when could we expect it? Third, I want to discuss how AI can help us at Autopsy, and specifically for us, how that can help us examining the post-mortem brain. And lastly, I want to discuss how we are implementing AI at Autopsy in the workup for our participants of the ADRC. So some of these initial slides are courtesy of Peter Cheng and Dan Chow, co-directors of our Artificial Intelligence Center at the School of Medicine, with whom we collaborate. So what is artificial intelligence? Well, very broadly, it is a program, typically a computer program, that is able to exhibit what we think of as some aspects of human intelligence. So it's a program that can sense, reason, act, or adapt to different situations. So something that we would consider an aspect of human intelligence. Then within that subset of artificial intelligence is an area called machine learning. And that is typically computer programs or algorithms that are given more and more data over time. And as it receives more data, the performance of the algorithm improves. And so it's a learning machine learning. Then third, within that subset of machine learning is something called deep learning or deep machine learning. And that is a subset of algorithms that are more complex. Multi-layered neural networks, sometimes in our field, convolutional neural networks, which are given a lot of data, so-called big data, vast amounts of data. And because of the more complex architecture and the vast amounts of data, these algorithms are able to do very sophisticated learning, and so-called deep learning. So, why all the excitement about artificial intelligence? And this is a very simplistic way, I think, of thinking about where we are today and why the hype. So, in green is human performance over time. And you think of human performance, we like to think, anyway, human performance improves over time as we evolve. But biological evolution is a very slow process, natural selection, those sorts of things. In contrast, cultural and especially technological evolution is very, very fast. And you see that in the blue line here. And that's really grows in an exponential fashion. So it really increases rapidly. And this is just an estimate of where we are today, but where we envision this going in the future, right? So the idea is that, very soon, if not already, the ability of computers to sort of enhance human performance will be really great and sophisticated, much like our use of our cell phones. Which we think of, and many of us refer to as our external brains already. But the idea is that artificial intelligence can really augment or extend the performance of us. So this is a different way that I think is very useful to look at artificial intelligence. And this is the so-called Gartner hype cycle. One can go to Gartner.com and look at all of the different emerging technologies that they follow. But this Gartner hype cycle, I think, is a useful way to think about technological innovation. They map out the expectations for a new innovation over time, and they divide it into 5 periods. The initial discovery and trigger of an innovation, which leads to a peak of inflated expectations, and then followed by what they call the trough of disillusionment. So it wasn't everything it was cracked up to be, and now that we learn about its blemishes, followed by the slope of enlightenment, where we see what its real sort of true capabilities will be, and finally the plateau of sustained productivity. And they map different technologies according by color and symbol, according to how long they believe it will take for a current technology to reach this plateau. So here are some of the more current ones. This was from just a couple of months ago for their emerging technologies for 2020. And if you look at the ones that are surrounding artificial intelligence, there are quite a few. You can see that overall, a lot of these new ones, they tend to bias it towards new technologies. You can see that they're on the first part of the curve there. But some of them have started to kind of peek over into that trough of, starting to peek over into that trough of disillusionment. And you can see that when they now also specifically map artificial intelligence technologies. This is from last year, but relatively new, again, because of this field. You can see there are quite a few technologies that have matured to the point that we're starting to understand the blemishes and limitations. I will note that there are a few of them that are already reaching sort of what people believe will be their plateau productivity, speech recognition, for instance. I wanted to point out a couple of interesting ones that will be familiar to people. First off, autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars, which we're also obviously very familiar with. According to them, we're really starting to understand the limits of that technology. And they believe that it's still a ways out before autonomous vehicles are fully realized. And similarly, the one that perhaps we fear the most as humans, artificial general intelligence, which is still at the very beginning of the curve, is still a long way out in their estimation, and really hasn't budged in several years from this position, according to Gartner and colleagues. So I think it will be quite some time, I think, before this is really realized. And I think as people become aware again of the limitations, this has become a little bit less perhaps of an imminent field. For our purposes, when we're thinking about autopsy and examining the post-mortem brain, these are the technologies shown here in blue that are most important. Machine learning, and again, these deep learning neural networks. And you can see they've really started to mature and are really coming into the period where, you know, these light blue dots, 2 to 5 years, where we can really start to imagine pretty extensive implementation of artificial intelligence in that area. So how can artificial intelligence help us with examining the postmortem brain, and what are we doing at UCI to implement AI? So this is one of many different articles, viewpoints on where people believe artificial intelligence will impact healthcare. And the focus of this one, I think, is important because it reflects the general feeling, I think, of the healthcare community, that the specialties or disciplines that will be particularly affected are the specialties that focus on images. So in particular, radiology and pathology. And so because those are obviously the specialties that are very involved in brain and post-mortem analysis, especially the pathology, this is where the opportunity comes for the implementation of AI in the autopsy. So the way that we envision it at UCI, AI at autopsy, is really the idea of AI extending the clinicians and researchers that focus on images, and really focusing then on the post-mortem brain. So for radiologists, that would be AI analysis of brain images, and there's an active project led by Doctors Sajadi and Stark to do very high resolution post-mortem brain imaging. For the pathologists, we think of AI on whole slide images. So again, those glass slides with sections of brain that are stained in different ways, which we can now digitize and then analyze the pattern recognition referred to in the previous slide. And then for the scientists, it's all about big data and discovery based on images, using big data from images as a way to make discoveries that weren't possible before because of the scale of the analysis that one can do now. So I thought it'd be worthwhile to take you through an example of how AI can extend the pathologist in an autopsy setting. So shown here first is some work actually done in my lab by Brett Johnson and Michael Neal, but particularly Brett, who did all of the manual counting for much of this work. What's shown here is a way to conceptualize how many cells does one need to manually count in a slide before we can get an accurate representation of that slide. And by accurate representation is represented in this case as a flattening of the slide. And so in this particular one slide, it takes nearly 2,000 cells to count. And for a single person, you were talking about hours to days to get an accurate representation of that one slide. In contrast, when you start to talk about artificial intelligence on a whole slide image, and this is actually a representation of the same image that was counted by Brett. And here, scored in orange, is a presence of a particular pathology in a cell, and in blue, the absence of a particular pathology in the cell. And with an AI algorithm, this slide contains over 60,000 cells, and the algorithm can generate an accurate count of that slide in just seconds. So what this means, one way of thinking about that, is that in the amount of time that it took Brett to get an accurate representation of one slide, the algorithm could generate accurate counts of thousands of slides. And so that's really where the power of AI comes in, especially on the research side for the discovery process, so that many, many different images can be analyzed in a way that wasn't possible before. So what are we doing about AI at autopsy at UCI? Well, this is a picture courtesy of Alessandro Martini and Elizabeth Head of the whole slide imaging core that we've established at the in the biorepository for the ADRC. And you can see the microscope and the scanner and the computer and some of the other equipment. This is really truly a collaborative between the ADRC and the Department of Pathology and Lab Medicine. This is a relatively high capacity slide scanner that has now been automated for unsupervised scanning. It is capable of doing both bright field images as well as fluorescent samples, and even for thicker samples, it is able to take 3D images. This is a little snapshot of the screen on the computer dealing with the different whole slide images here. You can see on the left and a particular image of a cortex from a participant that one can see here, and a little screenshot here as well. So it's the sort of the workflow with these whole slide images. Here's another example of our participant, a section of cortex stained for A beta. And you can see in low power, the cortex riddled with these brown plaques. And if we just zoom in on one area here, you can see that there's very high resolution of these scans, and one can very clearly make out the cellular detail and the detail of the plaques and the different sizes, patterns of the plaques. And just illustrating the power of the digital technology. Right. So what we really envision going forward and really are starting to work on is both the clinical workflow as well as the research workflow. So on the clinical workflow, that basically we're referring to the neuropathologic diagnosis and coming up with ways for artificial intelligence to help with the clinical diagnosis, the report that the participants' families will get after their loved one dies. And then secondly, on the research workflow, which is really not targeted to an individual patient or participant, but rather to the entire population, understanding Alzheimer's disease and related disorders in the context of the entire population. So that's really the research question and the research workflow. So for both of those workflows, we collaborate heavily with CAIDM. CAIDM is the Center for Artificial Intelligence in Diagnostic Medicine at UCI Health, led by Peter Chang and Dan Chow, who I mentioned earlier. They're both neuroradiologists, and they are both very dedicated to the idea of artificial intelligence being used to extend and enhance the ability of our clinicians in diagnosis. The picture of Peter and Dan, and when this was launched about 2 or 3 years ago in the School of Medicine here at UCI. And part of their mission is really to use deep learning for the detection, characterization, and prognostics, so prediction, to improve health. And part of that mission for CAIDM is training individuals so that they can do the coding for artificial intelligence algorithms. And I just wanted to highlight Peter here teaching Michael Neal, my graduate student, and I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the work that he is doing on the autopsy tissue. So before I get to some of that work, I did want to highlight a few of the different projects that are going on around digital pathology and AI at UCI. The first one being, again, mainly that clinical workflow I spoke to, but the digitalization of the neuropathological diagnosis, which is a collaboration with the Department of Pathology and Lab Medicine. A second large-scale project that involves myself and Peter Chang is a UC system-wide effort to develop a digital pathology infrastructure and artificial intelligence studies using that infrastructure, funded by the Office of the President, as well as the California Department of Public Health, and led by Brittany Duggar, a scientist at UC Davis. A third project is led by Frank LaFurla and Andrea Tenner, who many of you will know, and Kim Green as well, in this called Model ID, the project, NIH-funded project to generate the next generation of animal models for Alzheimer's disease. And they are also working with digital pathology and AI to analyze the brain in the animal models. And then within my own group, in collaboration with the ADRC, is really to automate the image analysis of the choroid plexus, a different part of the brain, the part that produces the cerebral spinal fluid that bathes the inside and outside of the brain. And that really is a collaboration also with Peter Chang, together with my graduate student, Michael Mia. So I wanted to show you a little bit about this UC system-wide infrastructure, which is, I think, very exciting. This was started in some ways by the paper published by Brittany, showing that artificial intelligence or convolutional neural networks could be used to classify Alzheimer's disease pathologies from brain sections. And one of the neat things that Brittany did in that project and for the projects going forward is to develop this web-based annotation tool to make it really easy for neuropathologists or researchers to score many different images in very short order. I think it's very creative. They use some game theory and other things like that to really incentivize us to do as much as possible. And this was a very creative and clever aspect of the work that they do and that we are doing with Brittany. And together, again, with Peter, as sort of one of the key artificial intelligence experts on the project. And then a little bit on the autopsy analysis of the choroid plexus. I'll show you an example here of a fluorescent whole slide image, which then, again, thanks to Brett, who counted all of the cells, the epithelial cells in this picture, and they're now color-coded for as a local density map for a particular pathology, referred to as a beyond body. So higher densities being lighter colored and lower densities being dark. And this is the map of this particular section after manual counting. And Michael developed, together with Peter, the AI algorithm to do the same section by artificial intelligence, and one gets a pretty indistinguishable map using the AI algorithm. And if one also breaks it down as a histogram distribution, the two methods, the manual and the AI, generated nearly indistinguishable representations of the image. Then Michael has gone on to do that for maybe 30 different sections. And Brett, along with an army of undergraduates and other helpers, has manually counted those approximately 30 sections as well. And this is looking at that particular pathology, the percent of cells affected by that pathology as a function of age. And one can see a pretty sharp age curve around 50s when one starts to see this pathology, with a couple of interesting outliers. When one does this by manual and then does it by the AI algorithm, the AI algorithm does pretty well compared to the manual. And if one looks at the comparison of the AI algorithm compared to the manual, it nearly follows a straight line with a very high R value, just showing how accurate the AI is relative to the manual count. And then kind of the last wave, if you will, of maybe not the last, it's just probably just the next wave of artificial intelligence is the analysis of 3D images. So for radiologists and pathologists, we are generally using two-dimensional images in our analysis and diagnostic work. But the next wave is really to be able to identify 3D images. And you can, I just wanted to show you, this is a whole mount image of a piece of post-mortem human choroid plexus. And I just wanted to show you this very quick movie as a way to see how three-dimensional this tissue really is. And of course, so many of these interesting pathologies and morphologies have a three-dimensionality to it. Now, it turns out AI coding for algorithm development for 3D images is a much more challenging proposition. But Michael and Peter have been able to make some headway in generating algorithms that appear to have quite decent performance in being able to recognize 3D morphologies. You know, one of the important things also here is this concept of an explainable AI. And some of you may have picked that up on the earlier Gartner hype cycle curve. And that one of the downsides of AI has always been this idea that it's a big black box. The computer is picking up on something, but the humans don't know what it is exactly. And so for images, there are different ways to make AI explainable, which is, I think, incredibly important as we go forward, both just for the science and for the rigor and reproducibility of the science. But here, this is a technique called feature occlusion, where in this case, this is one of these pathologies, these Biondi inclusions in the choroid plexus. And you can give this to the computer, but also then systematically block parts of the image to see when the performance actually degrades. And these white spots are the areas where if you blocked those parts of the image, the AI algorithm started to degrade. And you can see that the white images correspond to the green arms of this inclusion, and not to the central portion, actually, which is important, which is exactly what it should be picking up on. And so we can actually explain what the computer is picking up. So a very important feature of AI in general, and one that is certainly advancing quickly in the field, and one that we are trying to incorporate in our work at UCI. And with that, I wanted to thank a few people for the support for this work. I mentioned Alessandra and Liz in the biorepository, Peter and Dan in CAIDM. In the UC Consortium work, Brittany, Mike Kaiser is the AI expert at UCSF, who is working with Peter on this. From my lab, Brett and Michael. Obviously, for UCI Mind, Frank, Josh, and Andrea, who really hold everything together. I also want to mention the Precision Health AI initiative here as well, who are working very closely with Peter and Dan in CAIDM on this enterprise-wide initiative around precision health and AI and some of the funding resources. So with that, I would also like to thank you for listening, and I would be happy to answer any questions.